Council. And I think that Drew's talk in particular will draw a lot of attention to the land, its First Nation inhabitants, particularly the contradictory, and the colonial history that reverberates from the gold rush era and its continuing legacies and portrayals that we'll hear about. And I encourage everyone to check out Drew's article that I'm sure will be spoken about in the Canadian Art Review that delves into this as well, challenges the Yukon. And I also just want to share a quick personal anecdote, if that's okay, before we get started, about why it feels quite full circle for me to be opening this talk today. And that's because just over a year ago, fix that. Okay. I was not part of Yukon University. I came to the first ever research celebration event here at Yukon U and was listening to some fascinating researchers give talks, and Drew was one of those speakers. And as I was sitting there listening to the work that you were presenting, I thought to myself, this is a place I need to be. And a career change, and 14 months later, here I am getting to introduce Associate Professor of Social Sciences and Humanities, Drew Lyness, who is going to take over now with his talk entitled Popular Culture, Claims and Confusion in America's Yukon.
Thank you, Gemma, and thank you everybody for coming. All sorts of people. Turns out you're going to talk about the Yukon, really pack them in. Yeah, so it's interesting. It's being built as a research and progress book, and it is and it isn't. This piece of writing is now published online. I've never done a QR code before, but you can give it a go. But you can also just Google the Canadian Art Review, and they have a current edition out specifically on parks and wilderness, which was announced about 3 years ago when I started writing this piece. And I mean, partly I just thought, well, the Yukon needs to be in the Canadian Art Review piece about parks and wilderness, on both counts. And so I sort of started writing my way into the topic. To get published in Humanities, you need to use big words. So I've only used one big word, but it is phantasmagoric.
Well, this was
second-hand information from somebody who lives in Dorset. I was very happy to hear them say that's exactly the word they would use to describe Dorset. I'm not going to do a lot of big words today. I'm going to maybe keep it lowbrow, cartoons, memes, but get that word on the table. I think it is in many ways the perfect word to talk about the territory, but not the territory we live in, the territory of representation, the rumour of the Yukon. Phantasm is ghostly, illusory, dreamlike, or often nightmarish spectacle of modern consumer society. Made most famous by Jean Baudrillard. Those of you who've ever been proximate to anybody with a humanities degree, probably familiar. The simulacra and the simulacrum. The best way I've ever seen it described is through memes. And anybody who's been in any of my classes know that I love to use memes to teach. Stage one of the simulacrum is the image of the thing that has happened. The sign is a reflection of basic reality. Stage two, the sign masks a basic reality. The image becomes a distortion. We're now in the realm of the phantasmagoric. Stage three of Jean Baudrillard's simulacrum. The sign marks the absence of basic reality. The image calls into question what the reality is and if it even exists. And stage four, we've got into the realm of the weird. The sign bears no relation to any reality whatsoever. I am today going to show you a whole heck of a lot of images of the Yukon territory, and you can decide, and I don't think there's really a right answer, but you can decide on what stage of Baudrillard's simulacrum we are at. The particular review was interested in parks. Again, I encourage you to read the article, maybe like in my article, read the forward to the Canadian Art Review this month. There are a lot of parks in the territory. What, 45, 47,000 people now. We've got 8 territorial parks, 3 national parks, 7 Parks Canada managed historic sites. And I've always been interested in parks. I teach environmental studies here, as well as literature. And parks are, they're specific things. We are encouraged to think of them as spaces of preservation or conservation, but they are also bounded spaces, the spaces set aside. The word park derives from French Germanic root pen or enclosure. Yukoners, especially Yukon First Nations, really need to tell you that the other history of parks is usually tied with the forced removal of Indigenous populations from land. And we could look at Luani, the experiences around Burwash. We could look at Tombstone, Tombstone Territorial Park, founded as part of the H's final agreement. But the litigation and the court battles continued beyond that moment of 1998. We could also look at Dawson, past Canada's largest heritage monument in the territory. The other word that the Canadian Art Review was interested in is wilderness. And I have a real thing about wilderness. I think wilderness is a fascinating word. It's a word that's, you can't leave your house in the territory without bumping into the word wilderness, one way or another. And a lot of cultural history, a lot of humanities work increasingly talks about how wilderness is a construct. Wilderness is a fantasy. Wilderness is the suggestion that nature is not natural, but it is a manufactured and essentially acculturated term. We're going to talk about this a lot more, but again, I like memes. This is what I use in my environmental studies class. I think that's all the theoretical heavy lifting I was going to come at you with just now. But the fact remains that we in the territory have a really heavy investment in the word wilderness. We are here, Yamdiga campus, in the quote unquote wilderness city. If we really think about that term for a second, it's kind of an oxymoronic term, right? Is it a wilderness? Is it a city? If it's a city, how is it a wilderness? If it's a wilderness, how is it a city? Right? We have this strange, and then you look at the icon, the logo, and it is straight away invested in the story of extraction, which I think we're all very familiar with. Yukon Tourism currently advertises the territory as 80% wilderness. We might want to talk about that. And in a very real term, those of you who are familiar with sort of the field of Canadian literature will know that this idea of emptiness, wildness, wilderness is really deep in the sort of Canadian and by extension North American literary canon. The North is often discussed as a tabula rasa, right? It's a place that is empty, it's uncharted, it's unexplored. I want you to pay attention to these words because they're going to come back time and time again. The North is hostile, it's a space that is treacherous, a space that is uncivilized, and by extension, savage, that old colonial term. A place that is untamed, heroic, frontier, a place where men are men, a place that's wild, rugged, wilderness, a space that is mysterious, or unknown, or even unknowable, a space that is remote. And then the other sort of big elephant in all our conversations here is the Yukon is a space of mining, a space of extraction. It's very much tied with those tropes, with those stories. That top map there is the First Nation of National put out recently is a graphic. You can go on the National website and see the claims and the staking that has taken place since National signed that final agreement, 1993. So in 30 years, very little pink on that map, 1993, this in 2003, or sorry, 2023, was increasingly claimed, staked, bought, paid for, and primed for development. And again, there's a contradiction here, right? How can we be a space of wilderness, but also a space of mining? How can we be a space of extraction, but also a quote-unquote pristine landscape? There's an inherent tension, but I think we all know, we all recognize in the territory. And so I was sort of interested in how all these kind of conversations coalesce. And as with most coalition conversations right now, they sort of end up in the United States. Forbes magazine did a wonderful thing last year, right when the annexation conversation started. They did a little primer for American readers about Canada, naming its territories and its provinces, and they gave us a special mention, which I thought was really nice. Including the legendary Yukon. But the fact remains that it is legendary in America, and through the lens of American popular culture. Most of this has been sort of well documented by historians. William Morrison wrote about this. We have esteemed Yukon historians in the room, Michael Gates. It's a wonderful book about this for people who are interested. America, the Klondike in Hollywood. And yeah, it's a picture of the July 4th parade. And so we're obviously talking about the gold rush, and the gold rush is the American territory. Nobody in this room leads me to explain that. But it's over very, very quickly. There's 100,000 prospectors attempted to get here. Maybe 1 in 3, 1 in 4 made it. Out of them, the population does increase to maybe 30, 40,000 for a while. Most went home, most were American, and very few struck gold. But in that space, the mythology of the Yukon is born. This is a good conversation. Let's have a look at Sam Steele.
Oh, he sits there in his red coat, all spitting polished, and he says,
Where would you be going?
well, I'm going to the Klondike to look at your gold fields, if there really is any.
Not with this gambling gear and those revolvers. Men don't wear pistols in Canada.
Canada be damned. I'm going to the Klondike.
The Klondike is Canada. Pack those pistols in your saddlebags or get back to U.S. territory.
I'm an American. You can't do this to me.
In that case, I'll be lenient. We'll keep this gambling gear and you'll be back in the United States by sundown.
He never drew no gun. I could have shot that guy right there. Who was he anyway?
Superintendent Sam Steele of the Northwest Mounted Police.
Why didn't I shoot him? Damn it.
In the days of the gold rush, a policeman, Sam Steele, became a legend of the Klondike.
Sam Steele, at least outside the territory, is probably not the most famous Yukon. In fact, Sam Steele is often eclipsed because Sam Steele was not, at least I'm a relatively new Yukon. I've been here for about 8 years, but Sam Steele was not the rootin', tootin', shooting Lone Ranger, Wild West cowboy that Hollywood stories refer. He was interesting in his own way, but he was a boring mountain. He was very invested in safety, primarily. Curfews enforced in Dawson City during the gold rush, forced people to observe the Sabbath, where no prostitution, gambling was allowed to happen. And I think Pierre Burton has this great quote about the shooting of Dan McGrew, one of the most famous literary texts to come out of the territory by Robert Service, who we might talk about in a moment. Something to the effect of, if there was a Dan McGrew and there was a saloon in Dawson, there would never have been a shooting because a Mountie would have immediately confiscated the gun as soon as it arrived. And so these are not the stories, the sexy Yukon stories that Hollywood has liked to tell. And of course, we can't even get to the meat of this presentation without at least talking about Jack London, right? Jack London had an outsized mythological influence on the territory. Jack London was here for barely a year, didn't get any gold, did get scurvy, very nearly didn't make it out of the Yukon, and left with a carpet bag full of stories. And, even Call of the Wild or some sort of more famous texts, 10, 12, 15 TV shows and movies about this one guy's mythological fantasy of the territory. But then, in many ways, the one we live with. Older Yukoners will remember, or anyone who drove up 2 Mile Hill this morning, you're very lucky you weren't driving on Jack London Boulevard in 1995 when self-access was renamed to Robert Service Way. Robert Service was allowed, a little bit more vanilla. Jack London comes with some problems, mainly racial ones. He was not sympathetic to many people he met on his travels, not just here in the South Sea Islands as well. And so, very rightly, Yukon First Nation predominantly pushed back in 1996, and we do not drive on Jack London Boulevard anymore, just on boring old 2 Mile Hill. But we still have a bus downtown. I think my family might be zooming in from England, so I threw this in for them. Anytime there's an international documentary, people go, "Oh, I saw the Yukon," and you know straight away what it's going to be about. This was just the other year. I actually watched it with my dad at Christmas. And this is sort of the, by way of illustrating the lasting resonance Jack London has on all our lives.
I'm Gordon Buchanan. I've been filming wildlife for over 30 years. But my love of the natural world began as a child. As a 10-year-old, I read The Call of the Wild by Jack London, a book about gold rushers who commanded dog teams while seeking their fortune in Canada's Yukon. The book ignited in me a lifelong fascination for these incredible huskies.
Hop up, hop, 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 hop.
Bred over centuries to survive the harshest of conditions.
Jeez.
Enabling people to live in and traverse these hostile lands.
How'd I go to this?
Now, almost 40 years later, I'm heading to the Yukon.
Oh, it's exhausting.
To try and master a team of these powerful, intelligent dogs. To see if I too can conquer the trails that the gold rushers used.
Easy.
I'll be self-filming as much as possible.
Lights, camera, just need the action.
I'll have just 8 days to master the dog team.
I just feel I've got absolutely no control.
Before taking on one of the toughest challenges of my life. An ancient, treacherous trail of sharp corners, overhanging trees, and dangerous obstacles that would have beaten even the toughest.
I'm sure you could spot many of the tropes immediately. I think Yukoners are probably laughing because you recognise that he's just messing about on some very well-packed sledgehammers out in the Concession Island. But again, right? People are not invested in visiting us, or even the place, but they're invested in visiting the story of the place. So that's not unusual, but for a relatively sparsely populated territory, we have an outsized cultural footprint that, in my estimation, we need to start thinking about a little bit more critically. There's a history of this, and again, probably towards Hollywood and the Klondike for a really good inventory. Yukon pops up in Charlie Chaplin in the 1920s, but sort of like suggested rather than explicitly named. I think the Little Tramp is in one of the many cities in the far north. Mae West, Klondike Annie, even more sort of ambiguous. The Klondike Yukon is evoked, but I think it's set in Nome, Alaska. And this is really the era of the northern genre, the Mountie film, which of course, right, it makes sense if you have a space that is portrayed as empty or mysterious or ungoverned, uncharted, lawless. The fantasy then has to project law and order onto it. And so you get this real rush of northern Mountie films from about the 1920s through the 1940s. They're all pretty cheesy. I've tried to watch a few of them. But you can already see the names, right? We're in the Calway era. I'm a big Western aficionado. Murder on the Yukon, Renfrew, the Royal Mounted, Yukon Flight, Trail of the Yukon, Yukon Vengeance, Yukon Fever. Ironic, actually, since Jack London nearly died here. The most famous Mountie, and my favourite, is Sergeant Preston of the Yukon, the early 1950s.
The relentless pursuit of lawbreakers.
Oh, yeah.
Sergeant Preston of the Northwest Mounted Police with Yukon King, swiftest and strongest lead dog breaking the trail in the relentless pursuit of lawbreakers in the wild days of the Yukon. Back to the days of the gold rush as Sergeant Preston with his wonder dog Yukon King meets the challenge of the Yukon. This is the Yukon, the territory patrolled by Sergeant Preston. The land of the great stampede for gold, a land overrun by adventurers hardy enough to endure the rugged wilderness in their quest for sudden riches.
Yeah, Sergeant Preston of Yukon was largely filmed in Colorado and California. Very popular in the moment of the Lone Ranger. Many of you will remember the Lone Ranger. We'll come back to Sergeant Preston in a minute. Before that, I thought I'd give you some of the other sort of most recognizable icons of the territory you live in. Yukon Cornelius here. Interesting fact, we actually have a Yukon connection to Yukon Cornelius. As I understand it, John Glenn Morristown now owns the rights. You can Google that and find out more about it. Yvonne of the Yukon, quite Canadian television actually, but quite strong international purchase with a Quebecois trapper / prospector. Yukon Cornelius, by the way, obviously famous for digging his pickaxe into the earth and licking it, and it turns out it was peppermint. Extracting flavour and not mineral wealth from the territory. Millennials, elder millennials like myself might remember the Oregon Trail game. There is indeed a Yukon Trail version of the Oregon Trail, which you can still play online. Canada does not get mentioned, although you do cross the border and encounter the Northwestern Mounted Police. I assume from the Pacific Northwest, not this part of the Northwest. I don't think Yukon Ho, Calvin Hobbs is pretty interesting. Those of you of a certain era might remember this. It went from the 80s into the 90s. I actually have this on my child's wall and used to read this to him when he was quite young. And yeah, it's fun, but the highlighted passage is interesting in the context of this conversation. The Yukon is the place for us. That's where we want to live. And there we'll get to yell and cuss and act real primitive. Oh, what a life. We cannot wait to be in that Arctic land. Well, we'll be masters of our fate and lead a life that's grand. This is the idea that the Yukon is an escape, right? Which, I'm not talking about reality or fiction here. It's somewhere in between, right? I'm not saying people haven't escaped here and can't escape here, but it's an interesting and blanket portrayal of the place. 1950s through 90s, you start getting a lot of Disney investment in the Yukon. We're Klondike by men are men, women are women. A darn good arrangement. This could come from a modern manosphere. The main protagonist here is Scrooge McDuck, who finds, loses, refines his fortune in the territory, and Bugs Bunny, who is up here in search of 14-karat gold.
This is Dawson City in the Klondike, the year 1896.
Gold, 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 gold.
Overnight, Dawson mushroomed into a roistering, lawless, gold-mad boom town. Yes, there was fun for everyone. Down the street, a bunch of the boys were whooping it up at the Malibu Saloon. When a stranger walked in with a bag of gold, a simple-looking goon.
You can watch the rest on YouTube. Has another encounter with a conspicuously francophone bandit. And of course, we're bringing us into the era of modern reality television. One of the funny things about having a British accent and flying up here on North Canada is you're often surrounded by a lot of Brits, and you go, "Hey, you're from the UK, where are you from?" They say, "Oh, I'm from London." "What are you doing here?" "Ah, I'm up here to make television." So I've had some not academic or indeed ethnographic, social, scientific data, but some really good anecdotal data that A, this is an international fantasy playing out on Klondike Question territory. B, there is a very deliberate attempt to blur / mask / camouflage / obfuscate whether the Yukon is in Alaska or Canada, because this is syndicated, it's largely Discovery TV or Raw TV make it. And Gold Rush actually started as Gold Rush Alaska, it changed to Gold Rush. Yukon Gold is now defunct, I think we're about 6 seasons. Gold Rush is still going, I think about 13 seasons. And that gave birth as well to the Klondike miniseries that Michael and I were just chatting about earlier. And I think for those of you who are familiar with it, you probably know its relationship to reality. But there's real repercussions. Those of you who are from Dawson, and again, I would stress, I'm not talking about Dawson, I'm not talking about Klondike Question traditional territory, I'm talking about representations of it. But there are material effects. Increasingly, and we can talk more about mining. We're in an interesting moment in terms of the sort of revisiting very outdated mineral legislation in the territory. Even since I published this piece, conversations about royalties, and the fact that we're still charging royalties on the price of gold at $15, as it was in 1902, not $5,000 as it is today. And where a lot of the placer miners come from. But I thought one of the in doing this research, one of the interesting things I found evidence of is claims being used not actually for mining, but for the facsimile of mining, right? For making reality television. And then the differing impacts that has, right? When you have large generators, large lights, access roads, ATVs, film crews, quads, catering stations. We're in this very strange moment in the territory. And again, it's extraction. And a lot of people have written about extraction in the territory. The extraction can be mineral, but it can also be narrative. And we should probably mention the whole host of survival televisions up here as well. The tropes are pretty recognizable. I don't think you need me to elaborate too much on these. One of my favorite, however, is Yukon for Sale, which is Canadian television network until it was picked up by Destination America, who renamed it, little apocryphally, Buying the Yukon, which has a whole different ring in 2026, doesn't it? Can't resist this clip as well.
In a place like none other.
Life in the Yukon is like the Wild West.
With real estate that's out of this world comes Yukon for Sale.
I'm gonna find their dream Yukon home.
Each week, Yukon house hunters head out and see 3 properties.
Wow. I'm completely speechless because it's absolutely beautiful.
Jackpot! I am in love with this place.
Yes! Which will they choose as their dream home?
Not everybody in the world owns an island.
Wow.
Just look at it. It's rustic, Yukon-y, beautiful.
Whether they end up at the top of their budget.
I'm gonna have a heart attack.
Just sitting in the tub looking up through the northern lights.
At the bottom of the food chain.
What's that noise? Is it wolves?
We ran into a couple of grizzlies on the way out here.
Or out in the middle of nowhere.
Here we have your shower shack.
Out in the middle of nowhere. That's where you guys live. Hey, so to be serious, I'm very aware that I haven't quite earned my my stripes as an 8-year Yukoner. So I want to be very careful going at some of the sacred cows of the territory. But I would encourage us to think critically at some of our identity points in the brave new world we're entering. Not to say they have to go, they can stay. Maybe they are attended by actual narratives of this place, this people, these lands, and especially Yukon First Nations. It's not like we don't have some really awesome stories in the territories, right? Carmack, Sergeant Steele, Edith Josie. Really interesting to look through Ted Harrison's Northern Alphabet, how many extracted sort of messages are kind of slipped in there. So my favorite part of this research to finish, I'll try and get done in about 10 minutes here. The Great America theme parks. Oh my goodness. If I was still crossing that border, I would be in Gurney, Illinois right now. There were two. There was one in Santa Clara, California. They were both built in the 70s by Marriott Corporation. There's another Great America theme park in Gurney, Illinois, just outside of Chicago. They are configured around these sort of defining moments of United States history, where you get New Orleans, and you get Yankee Harbor, and you get agricultural narratives in Hometown Square, and the Southwest Territory, and you get the Yukon Territory, of course. Historically, the artwork's really interesting, and I've been writing about visual culture, so you can straight away see, I think, what Michael Sorkin, an architectural critic, has termed bare minimum signifiers. The wall tent, the log flume, the totem poles. Whole conversation about appropriation we could have there. And also be sort of like slightly confused onion domes, I think, evoking the brief Russian colonization of the Alaska Panhandle. And even more confusingly, this is why the word confusion is in the title of this talk, they have dolphins. There are 2 dolphins, 4 dolphins actually, across both parks. Nemo and Neptune, dolphins that perform in the Wilderness Theatre in the Yukon Territory, up until the 80s. The California park shut, still there, but the Yukon Territory is not part of it anymore. But today, the Yukon Territory is alive and well, although undergoing a little bit of redesign this year in Gurney, Illinois. Got rid of the totem poles in 2020, when such matters came under more international scrutiny. Evoking, obviously, to a Yukon eye, cultural forms in a cartoonish, crass, entirely culturally appropriated way. Yeah, get your dinner at the Claim Jumpers Saloon. You get beer at Snowshoe Bar. You can look at not authentic totem poles next to a Coca-Cola machine. And you can have a Yukon experience in the heartland of America. So another question obviously comes, and you can read the article if you're interested in the footnotes. Yeah, how much of the theme park is a Yukon, right? And I think there is a growing understanding amongst people in the territory that we spend part of our time in the simulacrum. I spent a lot of time in this document looking at Parks Canada. Parks Canada, to their credit, have, since Truth and Reconciliation, been quite involved in consultation, conversations, not least with Dawson's UNESCO status, has really spurred that conversation along. But, you know, the SS Kino, I think, is interesting. It was brought up to Dawson in the 60s as a gesture by the Yukon Tourism Board, purely because it was the only boat that fit underneath the bridge on the highway. Red Feather Saloon is a facsimile built in the 90s, rebuilt in the 90s. Dredge number 4 was raised up from the bottom of the Klondike River, 1967. Again, delicate conversation. I don't want to stick my neck out too far, but read the piece and make up your own mind about authenticity. I did spend a lot of time looking at the design guidelines of the historic document. Dawson, this is a fantastic repository of a beautifully illustrated. You can find this online in Parks Canada Archives. Just put noted in my essay. It is an incredible document, primarily an investment in this specific type of colonial aesthetic from a very specific moment in the Yukon's history. The document stipulates all manner of local urban design requirements, including architectural facades, streetscape materials, construction signage, and maintenance techniques. Its rollout is ambiguous, depending on who you ask. I think my read is that sometimes it's been enforced more than others, in combination with a network of municipal codes that govern building decisions, what can and can't be presented as authentic in the Klondike. Its stated goal in the forward of the document is to ensure planning boards can judge whether proposed developments conform with the architectural and architectural style common in Dawson during and immediately following the gold rush of 1898. Indigenous political scientist Mishwani Gurman has termed this colonial spatializing, the way that a landscape through architectures, through aesthetic design choices is territorialized, is nationalized, is brought into national narratives at the expense of people in a place. Back to Sergeant Preston. Those who've been in the territory for a long time will know about the Big Inch land promotion, but this talk would not be complete without it. So look at time, like a few minutes. Familiar with the Big Inch land promotion? So Challenge of the Yukon was a radio show in the late 40s. It gave rise to Sergeant Preston, which you just watched the intro of. Quaker Oats, in a moment of absolute genius marketing, decided they were going to send an ad man up to Dawson with a briefcase full of money, and for, I think, 1,000 Canadian dollars in 1952-54, purchased about 19 acres of land in West Dawson, which was then subdivided, technically, into, I think, 20 million 1 inch by 1 inch parcels of land, which is subsequently given away with breakfast cereal to consumers all over the territory. Quaker Oats didn't pay their taxes, unfortunately. So about 15 years later, the land reverted back to the federal government. The deeds are baseless. I've got one in my office. It cost me $40 on eBay. This saga is wonderful because it illustrates a certain attachment, right? You might even say an entitlement to land. Commodification of land, commodification of place. My favorite part, which is a little bit less known, is the prospectus power promotion, when 20 million American consumers were pissed off because they couldn't claim their deeds to the Yukon territory. Quaker Oats had an even better idea. They dredged sand from the bottom of the Klondike River, put it into tiny little baggies, and mailed it to people's homes in the United States. But they mailed it from Alaska to get around international postage laws. And Senator Van Rogen at the time, who was overseeing the jurisdictional operation, was quoted as saying, it doesn't matter about the Alaskan postmark. Most Americans think the Yukon is Alaska anyway. If you read my essay, I spend quite a lot of time with artists who push back at the myth, just to finish the piece. Kevin Michael Murphy, quite brilliantly, in 2015, made tiny miniature models of Dawson buildings out of the deeds themselves, and then photographing in situ on their corresponding 1 inch by 1 inch parcels of land in West Dawson. Now where Dawson is now. I'll let you read all about it. Wonderful art project. It was installed at the Art Gallery in Dawson. Spent a little bit of time with Leanne Charlie's Moose, which many of you will remember, Bullseye, from 2018. Again, spent some time reading the piece, engaging with Leanne's critique. Leanne and Nick have a corresponding installation right now across the road here at the Yukon Arts Centre, Caribou Project. Leanne was especially interested in questioning ceding release clause in the umbrella funding agreement, highlighting category A, category B land. And I think in terms of the Big Inch promotion, it was, if you actually spend some time with the legalese, the Quaker Oats lawyers knew what they were doing. These deeds did not have subsurface mineral rights. They did have easement and access guaranteed. Draw your own conclusions. I also spent a little bit of time with the SOVA document, wonderful document from 2011, where SOVA students led by Charles Stankovic spent a whole bunch of time doing what they called a sort of interpretive layer analysis of the buildings in Dawson within the last 10, 15 years. If you're really interested in that sort of battle over authenticity. This is a fantastic document to read, and again, it's linked to my article. Dawson students, Sober students at the time, talked about their dynamic community trapped within a historic monument. And finally, Cole Pauls is many of you will either know or be familiar with his work. Some of it hangs downstairs here. Very graciously let me share some of his graphic novel work, which is bilingual and Samtachoni, work in language revival. And Cole so wonderfully uses form line and deploys Dredge number 4 as a spacecraft, forcibly assimilating Yukon Indigenous population. And the dredge as a metaphor, dredges as a metaphor for all forms of extraction. I think pretty clear here. Couples, Telford and Champagne-Ajac has, I think, some of the most exciting Indigenous literature anywhere right now has been recognised as such. But if you're not familiar with Dakota Warriors, you'll find it in the bookshop near you. And so, yeah, to finish the talk, I think there's a forthcoming book chapter that I'm sort of working on this a bigger picture, a question of representation in the territory. But I suppose if we're thinking about reforming mineral legislation, if we're thinking about land use planning, if we're thinking about the identity of the territory, the operational question seems to be, which territory do we want to live in? Do we want to live in the simulacrum on the right, the extractive territory on the left, or can we find a middle ground? Thank you. There's a QR code again, and I was interested in the piece. Will we see the questions online?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Thank you for coming, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for this excellent talk. Many years ago, the Northern Review published an article, and in it talked a little bit more about the images more of the Arctic, but a rather fabulous picture that it was published, and it was a line drawing from a 19th century British publication of a queen seated on a grand ice throne, and the title around it was Arctic, because of the Arctic, as image of the metaphor of the Arctic, and the title around it was called Waiting to be Won. And I wonder if there's a way you could work kind of the gender thing into this as well.
I mean, very much so. Portrayals of, thank you, Amanda. The portrayals of the North as virginal, or they're waiting to be seized, waiting to be taken. And then Margaret Atwood does good writing on this. And, you can see through this as a heavy masculinist sort of investment in the ruggedness of the territory. And I'm an American studies scholar originally, and that's pretty deep in the US frontier mythology, right? And so we're talking. What's interesting, I was saying to Michael there earlier, in the process of writing this, in my mind, it's sort of kind of become an Arctic sovereignty conversation, right? Like we're just spending a lot of time right now thinking about Arctic security, sovereignty, and of course, sovereignty, that word in territory, means a whole different thing. And identity packs onto that, and deciding who Yukoners are, not were, but are and will be going forward, seems increasingly about having strong community, strong investment in institutions, and trust, right? And living in the shadow of somebody else's fantasy, it only gets us so far.
I have a question. First, thanks very much. I love the phantasmagoria angle with this. Like you nailed it with that kind of characterization. I had a very niche observation, which I think you'll appreciate as someone from the UK. In that real estate show, the weird kind of like illustrations and animation thing that pops up partway through is basically a log cabin on what is essentially a Motte and Bailey castle foundation. Which of course the Normans used to, in a very kind of like proto way, colonize what was England at that time. And now you're talking about this kind of northern security angle, and I was wondering if you can kind of unpick that a little bit more, because in this phantasmagoric characterization, the Arctic security conversation becomes actually even more invidious in a lot of ways, because that's really what D&D is kind of threatening to do, is recolonize the landscape through military installations, which is exactly the Norman strategy post Hastings. How deep down this rabbit hole do you want to go, and how far can we kind of push the analogy to really start coloring what's happening in kind of further phantasmagoric states, and how do we open up a bigger conversation around a more human way of having these very real, very important conversations in the present, but bringing other voices, other perspectives to the fore. That was the thing that was really like eating at my brain throughout this whole talk. I really loved it. Thank you very much.
For those that don't know, Keith's a medievalist. I see a collaboration coming on Keith. Thank you. Yeah, I think I mean, it also sort of connects to the parks question, right? I'm so interested in probing that parks as private property, parks as right, like that we're sold this fantasy of parks. It's harder to see somehow in territory because Killarney is like in some ways behind the curtain. You go to Yellowstone Park and you can see the sort of the land grab, the Norman origins of these sort of like nature fantasies being played out in this, what is an American or in Canada, the Land Dominions Act, and model of land ownership via federal parkification of nature, and its relationship with extraction, right? Yeah, there's so much, and in just thinking about borders and, like you say, the sort of the way that you encroach militarily through culture, right? And you drive up the North Canal, you've got Mactung there, being directly influenced by the US military right now, to bring out precious minerals that are critical to military infrastructure. Yeah, lots we could talk about. We should have a bit. Let's do it.
For me, as like an artist, a lot of my practice has to do with kind of Yukon identity politics and plays with some of these ideas. And while watching your presentation, one of the things that became clear to me was how internalized a lot of these politics are. I think even like when you were presenting yourself and position yourself as someone who's lived here 8 years, I mean, I think this whole room knows it's a classic conversation that happens in the Yukon. That there's this kind of and something I see infiltrated into a lot of our politics. I was just curious about something you kind of witnessed as well, is like how these kind of like views of who is or isn't a real Yukoner is kind of imbued in a lot of our political conversations, and I think also leads also some of the ways in how our policy is put in place too, right? What is the Yukon supposed to look like versus what does it actually look like? And especially a place that has so many people that have come from abroad, who's, myself as well has moved here from another place. So my first interactions with the Yukon as an idea were with a lot of these symbols. So I think, I don't know where the question is in there, but
no, I think that's smart, and thank you. I think so. I have a 7-year-old who was raised but not born with territory. Him and I go back and forth on this all the time. He, for matters of convenience, popped out at Vancouver Women's Hospital, but was up here within about 2 weeks. He will not let me call him born and raised. And I just shut up. Shush. I think that that's tied with authenticity, right? And to be clear, like, I quite like the fantasy of the Yukon. I kind of live in that fantasy too, right? When I sent a paragraph to my old school magazine in the UK the other week, and I might have played up some of the sort of rugged outdoorsness myself. I think that's real. I think there's room for us to accept that, but also accept it's a fantasy, right? And I think partly where this article was going is, as we all know, the political mechanisms of the territory are glacially slow. And art in recent years has actually been really dynamic, and especially in the Klondike, especially in the Yukon. And I slightly feel like the 3 or 4 artists I chose for this piece were because I knew it was going to be read outside. And anyone who's ever written anything about the Yukon knows that you have to expend like half your word count explaining things about the Yukon to people who are not from the Yukon. And so I think in the territory, I probably would have chosen some different artists, or at least really people that might be a little bit more sort of fine-grained and textual for us all to understand. But you know, when you're pushing back against grand narratives, you kind of have to use loud colors, primary colors. Michael.
One of the, can you hear me all right?
It's just online, they can't, yeah.
One of the most interesting books that influenced me was one by Per Burt called Hollywood's Canada.
Oh.
I don't know if you've read it or not, but he compares, in a way, he's making fun of Hollywood for the way they portray the Yukon and Canada in general. And it's a really good illustration of how Hollywood has been very important in shaping the American perception of what Canada and the Yukon are like.
Well, thank you so much for your work on this as well, Michael. I think that sort of the idea of the vanilla, boring, law-abiding Mountie ties in with American stereotypes, right? Hollywood stereotypes, Canadians, that's lightness, the don't want to rock the boat kind of disposition. And I think that's why it's so interesting. And I know you might want to speak a little bit about this, but with your experience advising television shows, why a character like Sam Steele, it was fascinating in his own right, doesn't quite do it for the television audiences, right? And I think those are the sort of characters we should be able to claim as a territory to push back at, and there is Sergeant Preston's or the Due South or the Mountie shows. Yeah, we, you know, I think there's a world to live under Hollywood shadow, but it seems increasingly to matter here for, I think, reasons that just came up, because there's a politics to it, and we internalize it.
Okay, we're out of time in this room, but Drew, I don't know if you have a few minutes to stick around.
Sure.
So you're welcome to come and chat. There's still cookies and coffee and punch. And thank you, Drew. That was fantastic.